Hi everyone, welcome to the pre-show. This is where we get started and discuss a few of the issues that are in the news before we go to our main TV broadcast. Make sure to stay tuned because after the broadcast, we're going to continue some of this conversation, get deeper into it during our post-show right here on the Stream website. Welcome y'all, it's great to have you guys in the house. The news of the day, or at least one of the things that people have been discussing, is this whole scandal with the IMF chief. And apparently Dominique Strauss-Kahn, head of the IMF, has been held in New York on charges of sexually assaulting a maid at the Sofitel. Right. The word is that he was taken actually off the plane at JFK.
That's what's really sketchy about it. He was, I saw his lawyer, I saw some of the footage from the hearing, and they were trying to get, the judge to agree to allow him to post bail. I think it was like $1 million or something. Yeah. And she agreed against it because she's like, it's a bit sketchy and it's a bit risky for us because
he was already.
You were about to get on this plane and flee to France, and because there's no, I don't know, what was it? That there's
no diplomatic immunity. And,
right.
He left the hotel room so quickly, apparently. He left his cell phone in the hotel room. He'd left these personal items that none of us can, fathom traveling without, and bolted for the plane and was pulled off 10 minutes before takeoff.
Right.
I mean, that's hard to argue you're not a flight risk.
Yeah.
After they catch you escaping.
Literally. He has a deal with, apparently he has a deal with Air France where he's allowed to walk onto any Air France plane and get a first class seat. So it's not like he had to purchase the ticket in advance or, go through all of the rigmarole the rest of us have to do when we
He wasn't all up in orbits like the rest of us.
You guys have to see this. Look, this guy, KJ Healy, wrote, "No one told Dominique Strauss-Kahn that being director of the IMF doesn't mean you get to do to people what the IMF does to countries."
Wow.
He was staying in a $3,000 a night hotel. He gets to fly first class. He leads this rather decadent life that's sort of averse to what he's supposed to be doing.
It's interesting because a couple of things politically. He was one of the leading contenders for the French presidency, French presidential elections next year. They're saying he's a guy who could potentially unseat Sarkozy, but from the Socialist Party. Well, the word is that they've been calling him a caviar socialist for years because he's got these finer tastes in life, but then allegedly, supposed to be down for the people
His wife is an American-born French journalist, and they were photographed a couple weeks ago leaving some party and getting in a Porsche.
But it wasn't their Porsche.
But it wasn't their Porsche.
Apparently it was somebody else's Porsche, so that makes it better.
Yeah, and he does have a history of sexual
improprieties.
Improprieties, yes, that's a good word for it. Yeah, and he apologized for having an affair with someone a year ago, and so this isn't.
But nothing criminal has been alleged before.
No.
Let's check in. I think we've got a Skype guest. Can you hear us, Skype?
Yes.
Excellent. Our audio sounds good. Everybody just say hi, just so we make sure.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Hi.
You can hear the whole gang? Okay, awesome, man.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. We're going to just be going through some of the pre-show. We're going to give the setup of the story at the top of the show. We'll come to you in just a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, thanks a lot. So one of the things that I think is interesting in this, and to that point of the tweet and how the IMF deals with different countries, I have not been a fan of a lot of IMF policies. I think some of their structural adjustment programs really wind up hindering development in different countries rather than helping it. But in the wake of the financial crisis, a lot of people say that the IMF had a positive impact. Well now, and particularly with what's been happening in Europe, with Greece and with Ireland and with Spain, all going through these potential debt issues, if the IMF doesn't have a credible leader, or if they find out they have some, get hung up in succession of leadership, I think the more interesting story here is not just what happens to him personally, but what is the impact for the EU.
Well, I think it's worth noting that last year when he had this affair and it made all these headlines, the IMF, I think, stood behind him, let him keep his job, accepted the apology, and really went with him because they felt he was so effective as the head of the IMF. Yeah. And very quickly after he was pulled off the plane on, I guess, Saturday it was, they disassociated themselves with him in like a 3-line statement that there was no interpretation required. They are done with him.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So there's a job opening there. So everybody send in your resume. If you want to run the IMF. Apparently they're looking.
Yeah. I think they were probably preparing for his eventual departure though, because it was almost a given that he was going to be running against Sarkozy for president, but probably not.
So many elections coming up.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I wonder what would happen if one of the presidential contenders in Egypt had a similar scandal.
Well, no one wants to run for office now. We just had Mike Huckabee drop out here and Donald Trump, not that he was a serious candidate, but
Huckabee dropped out.
Huckabee dropped out over the weekend and Trump dropped out this morning.
I'm curious on your perspective, so you do a lot of reporting from the Middle East as Cairo bureau chief. But what impression do people there have about the IMF?
I think they look at it as one of the institutions that was, one of the international institutions that backed the Mubarak regime. A lot of the money investments that went in there, obviously, some would argue helped Egypt's development in certain areas, but that money never trickled down to the people. And so when they look at it, it's one of the financial institutions that had its hand in the pie in Egypt, reaping a lot of the benefits from the wealthy class, but not enough for the people. So,
see, I think that's exactly what a lot of people say in sub-Saharan Africa, that you've got the, you know, the IMF putting these structural adjustment programs, dealing with your governments, and that you never seem to see any benefits on the ground.
You know, it's funny. I was on the website, on the Al Jazeera website, and I saw a story. Let me adjust my shirt. I saw a story about Suzanne Mubarak, right? Having not heart palpitations, but having a panic attack when she was told that she would have to go to jail. And it's just funny, you know, the kinds of stories that make the news, and if you think about, you know, the grand scheme of things, it's only because she's the former president's wife, so on and so forth. But it just got me thinking, like, you know, as I read the story, like, you know, there's a lot of different things that she has been complicit of, supposedly, or at least has been accused of, in terms of, like, really harming people's lives, or at least, just corruption, you know, that's why. So for her to have this panic attack, for it to make headlines.
Mubarak's wife?
Yeah, did you see?
Oh my God, like that whole panic attack thing. I'm like, yeah, you should be panicked, because now you're potentially going to be held to account for what you've been doing for the last 30 years. I mean, I wasn't surprised at all. I was, when they said, well, I'm not going to be, you know, cruel, because they were saying she was having, they thought she was having a heart attack first. Then they said it was a panic attack. Well, I mean, that's the thing. It's like, I don't want to revel in the suffering of this lady.
No, of course.
You know what I'm saying? But there's some really serious issues that need to be addressed from what they did.
But it's hard to garner sympathy, too. It's hard to,
That's the challenge. That's the challenge. Okay, so it looks like we're getting ready to go. We got about 30 seconds. We're about to go live, so stay with us. We're going to be broadcasting actually in a few more homes than usual today. We'll be telling you why in a second. We'll see you in a few. Hi, I'm Derek Ashong, and you are now in the stream, a social media community with its own daily TV show. We are bringing you, as always, the stories that are ongoing, global, and sourced from social media. Today, activists march for Palestinian rights. How could their efforts impact the Arab awakening? And what do they mean for the future of two new political entities in the region? I want to start by welcoming 30 million new viewers from Free Speech TV in the US. Thanks for joining us. We're glad to have you as part of our global community. Of course, as always, we have our digital producer, Ahmed Eldin. Also with us today is Glynnis MacNicol joining us on the couch. She's the editor of Business Insider's media page, The Wire, and Al Jazeera's own Ayman Mohyeldin, who is our Cairo bureau chief. Thank you both for joining us today. It's really a pleasure to have you. Glynnis, I know that you were just in Spain. A lot of things going on there. What did you see?
Well, I should clarify, I was in Spain on a vacation, so it wasn't a work trip. I wasn't reporting from Spain. But it was certainly interesting. You know, Spain suffers from the highest unemployment in Europe right now. And while you didn't see sort of evidence of that on a obvious day-to-day basis, what I did really note was in sort of all of these places where we normally associate with jobs with sort of young people at cafes, bars, restaurants, you really noticed that the people that were running these places and serving you your drinks or your coffee or whatever in these sort of hip places, a lot of them were older, you know, between 40 and 50, and it was rather striking that, you know, the sort of population that we certainly don't associate here, especially in our major urban areas, with like a bartender. We're holding on to these jobs.
Well, that makes you wonder what's happening to the young people. What jobs are they doing? We're going to get a little deeper into Spain in just a sec, but Ayman, you've been doing some amazing reporting on the Arab awakening What brings you, we're going to get deeper into Arab awakening issues as well, but what brings you to D.C. today?
I'm here to participate in Al Jazeera's inaugural U.S. forum. It's going to be an exciting few days. They've brought together a great team of journalists from Al Jazeera from the Middle East, some American journalists, experts, and some politicians for what is going to be at least a very lively dialogue.
I think that's going to be really exciting, all about the future of media. Hopefully tomorrow we're going to get a chance to talk to some of those folks, so we'll get into that. If you have any questions for either of our guests today, definitely tweet us at AJStream, and we'll do our best to get those questions into them. Ahmed, what kind of stuff have people been saying online?
Well, we've definitely seen the spirit of protest dominating the mainstream media, but it's also dominating essentially the social networks. We got a tweet from someone named Joseph K, who told us to please help us spread what's happening in Spain. So the Spanish media are ignoring or manipulating what he's calling a hashtag, the Spanish Revolution. Now, just very quickly, if we look at the actual trends map, we see that this hashtag, Acampa da Sol, has been, being shared and has been talked about across the world. It was actually earlier today the highest trending topic on Twitter. And so essentially what's happening is, we've seen over the past weekend people protesting in the Arab world, in solidarity with the Palestinian plight and across the Arab world. But, right here we've seen, I'm just going to play some video, a lot of people tweeting in that they want to highlight what is tens of thousands of students, essentially, and social groups and unemployed Spaniards, as she mentioned, have been gathering in 50 cities across Spain and staging a protest against the government's austerity measures and the role of the banks and political parties, the role they've played in the financial crisis. So if we just, I'm going to just share also this quick image. The day after the protests, which were yesterday, we saw people essentially camping out at the square, Puerta del Sol in Madrid, where I think you were.
It's a very big square.
And so, clearly they've had an unemployment issue for a long time, and I just want to get your thoughts, because a 20% unemployment in Spain is the highest in the Eurozone. Ayman, do you think there's a correlation maybe between the spirit of protest in the Arab world and the fact that the Spanish youth staged this protest?
Well, without being in Spain, it's actually difficult for me to kind of gauge the mood and attitudes of the people. But what I can tell you definitely is that there is kind of an awakening now where people and citizens and the youth who have for so long been disenfranchised in many parts of their government's policies are probably watching what's happening in the Middle East unfold and feel a sense of empowerment. And I think, we talk about it a lot, but there's no doubt that when you see somebody else in another part of the world take on a regime, whether it's the Egyptian regime or something as brutal, there's no doubt that people in Spain and other parts feel like, we should demand our rights and take to the streets. I mean, we saw people in Wisconsin waving Egyptian flags when they were protesting.
Absolutely, and
right.
I was hearing people talk and using the hashtag walk like an Egyptian in the U.S., but I also heard people talking about when is this going down in other parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, people in Zimbabwe, people in Uganda talking about the same thing. So
I also think it's worth noting that the access people in Spain and Europe in general have to the internet and Facebook is, across the board. So it's not, it's much more accessible and much easier to bring these groups together via Facebook. So you see all of this coverage and you think, I have something to protest.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see if they actually have an impact. As always, we want you to know, our community, that you can tweet us at AJStream to share stories about what's happening in your community. We rely on you to help keep us informed.
My name is Trin. I am a blogger and contributing editor to NoFirewall.net. I'm a member of Vic Thun. I am from Vietnam, and I'm a part of the street.
People around the world used hashtag May15 to remember what the Palestinians called the Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic, and references the 1948 creation of Israel, when more than 700,000 Palestinians were made homeless. Netizens used the occasion to demand the right of return for Palestinian refugees and call for a third intifada, or uprising, against the Israeli occupation. Here's a story where we're seeing transnational interest. Basically, you've had Palestinian activists and sympathizers across the Middle East, in places like Lebanon, in Syria, Jordan, the countries that are bordering Israel, calling for significant marches to commemorate that May 15th, which was yesterday. One of the interesting aspects of this is that the Egyptian foreign minister a few weeks ago called for the opening of the Rafah crossing to Gaza, and now we've seen, a couple weeks later, the crossing has not been opened. A lot of people decided they were going to take buses and go through from Cairo to Rafah to cross over into Gaza, and they were stopped by the Egyptian authorities. So you have this interesting situation standing around the borders of Israel in commemoration of that time, and we're not quite sure where it's going to go. Joining us right now to discuss this from Cairo is Mohamed Wahed, a member of the National Front for Justice and Democracy, and one of the organizers behind the Egyptian protest effort. Mohamed, welcome to the stream.
Yes, hi, welcome.
So tell us a little bit about your activities. Did you attempt to go to Rafah, or were you protesting in Cairo this weekend?
No, we tried to go to Rafah. Like many others, there was something like 50 convoys from different parts of Egypt trying to go to Rafah, and they were all stopped on the way somewhere between Wednesday and May 14th. So until Saturday, people were trying to go.
And how close did you get to the border?
The closest went as far as Ismailia, which is roughly 250 kilometers away from the borders. And some managed to sneak in with private cars. So something like 3,000 people were in Rafah at that day. But the majority, roughly 200 buses, were stopped from different parts of Egypt. Now, so it's something like the ones who managed to get in actually is no more than 1 to 2% of the people who tried.
Actually, one quick thing, I'm wondering what exactly then was the goal of this? And first, are you also part of this idea of a call for a third intifada, or were you simply hoping to visit people? Were you making a political statement? What was the purpose of the mission to cross the border?
No, the mission was not to instigate a third intifada. We've always commemorated the Nakba. This is a regular thing that we do every year. But this time it comes after 2 revolutions, and we think it's time that we rearrange the whole region. So whatever had stopped us before is no longer there. So that's I think what inspired the people to call for a third intifada, like, you know, replicate what happened in Egypt and Tunisia and what's going on in different Arab countries, Libya, Yemen, Syria, in Palestine too.
You know, we've heard, you know, that the foreign minister called the former President Hosni Mubarak's policy on Gaza disgraceful, and we've seen that, you know, according to the head of the Egyptian head of the Rafah crossing, he's saying that more people are being prevented from being able to cross from Gaza into Egypt and cross across the border. And yet they talk about opening the border, and clearly we have a tweet here from Mohamed saying that the decision's been made and they tried to go, but, you know, the Egyptian army blocked them from crossing into Sinai. And we see here buses that were trying to leave at 10 a.m. Just to corroborate what you're saying, the Egyptian army, this came through a couple of days ago, saying they won't allow them to cross into Rafah. But the idea is we have a tweet from our Cairo producer on May 13th showing a picture of what seems to be tens of thousands of people in Tahrir gathered once again. So, you know, what's really going on with regards to the government from your perspective? Like,
in my opinion, they changed rhetoric a lot. But as far as policy on the ground is concerned, they're exactly like the previous regime. That was very clear last night when they actually shot protesters who were protesting in front of the Israeli embassy. They actually shot at the rally. It was late at night. These people, the people who rallied yesterday, were the people who were prevented, or at least a fraction of the people who were prevented from getting to Rafah. So they decided to rally in front of the Israeli embassy. Late at night, there was something like 5,000 of them left, because the others had stayed in front of the embassy, and the others had left. The police clashed with them, and eventually they injured 350 out of maximum 5,000, including 1 shot at the head, and arrested 168 of them. So the fraction of the people who were injured in this, and actually this is probably the highest casualty rate in all of the activities that were made to commemorate the Nakba in the region, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan. Egypt has the highest rate of injuries, the highest rate of arrests.
We do want to acknowledge that there was a young man that was killed in East Jerusalem. I mean, I want to get some of your insights into this, because it seems like the Egyptian government has cracked down significantly, but what are the geopolitical implications if they were to truly open the Rafah crossing?
Well, I think, the Egyptian government, particularly the military, is in a very difficult position. I mean, there are two simultaneous Egypts that kind of exist today. One is the revolutionary Egypt driven by those who participated in the revolution, ideals, values, trying to reform the country. And at the same time, an Egyptian government which is trying to maintain law and order, trying to preserve international agreements, trying to preserve regional stability because Egypt is a linchpin in the region. So the Egyptian government is trying to reconcile how does it move forward, how does it reform itself, with at the same time perhaps a little bit of self-preservation and at the same time the self-preservation of things that are regional. So it cannot have, and we've already gone through this once before, where Palestinians suffering from the siege broke through the border, crossed into Egypt, and for the better part of 2 or 3 weeks, I think, there was complete chaos on the border between Egypt and Gaza. That's something the Egyptian government right now does not have the resources to cope with. They just simply cannot tolerate another situation like that.
On that line, Hamas, Khalid Mashal of Hamas came out and said that he was, warning and cautioning Egyptian activists not to go on march, and we saw the same response from the Muslim Brotherhood. So clearly there's a sense that Egypt isn't ready to be brought into a potential confrontation with Israel. And to that point, we have a question from European Muslima saying, how likely is it that the Rafah border, in your opinion, will open permanently? And more importantly, Ayman, do you get the sense that there's an increased pan-Arabist sentiment in the Middle East as a result of the Arab Spring?
One, I think that it's the Egyptian government, the current one, the Nabil al-Arabi, he's been very outspoken that the previous policies of the Egyptian government have been shameful and borderline criminal in the way it was complicit in the siege on Gaza. I think that there's going to be a realignment of Egypt's foreign policy, particularly when it comes to the Palestinians. I think we shouldn't confuse symbolism and practicality. The Egyptian government for years has been seen as complicit in Israel's policies towards Gaza, towards the Palestinians. But people have always felt that Egypt holds a very specific or special weight in the hearts and minds of the Arab world, a symbolic weight. And I think people want to see Egypt reemerge and become a pan-Arab leader, fight on behalf of Arabs, fight on behalf of Palestinians. And that's certainly what they expect from a new incoming Egyptian government. Only time will tell whether the Egyptian government lives up to the ideals of that, because that was one of the core issues of the revolution.
I want to get some more from Mohamed in just a second on that point, but Glynnis, before we do, I'm curious from your perspective, what are the implications of the fact that the United States has so much military and economic aid going into Egypt? I mean, how likely is it that Egypt is going to take any precipitous changes in their foreign policy with that aid there?
I would suggest it's unlikely, but I was going to ask Ayman, if they did open that border, it would not just be destabilizing for Egypt, but for the region in general, I think. Am I correct in thinking that?
No, not necessarily. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be destabilizing for Egypt or the region. It matters the mechanisms that are put in place. Now, the sad reality of it is there are arrangements and agreements that have been put in place prior to the revolution, which will, to some extent, still be binding, because the Egyptian government has come out and said that it wants to abide by these previous agreements. But it is going to be a factor for them to have a foreign policy that reflects the will of the people more so than the interests of America and Israel.
Now, Mohamed, I'm curious, because it seems like you mentioned that there was this significant casualty rate in Egypt, in Cairo specifically, more so than in the sister protests across the region. But it also seems like this was a very rough response from the security forces, even as compared to some of what we saw in the latter phases of the January 25th revolution. How do you compare what you saw between the way the security forces responded to protesters yesterday and how the security forces and the military responded to the initial revolutionary protests?
I would say we're starting to see some, they're reviving some of the old techniques. And a week before this crackdown on the protest, the cabinet had already empowered or provided the security forces with the right to shoot at protesters or at anyone who tries to break into public buildings. So they've already been, this is something that's been building up. And probably this is one of the most decisive or most powerful representations of this very, how do you call it, a strong, such a strong reaction, heavy-handedness. This heavy-handedness is probably, this is the strongest manifestation of it, but it's been growing very slowly in the past 3 months. And they've been improving or introducing new laws. They've renewed the emergency law. They've introduced a new law that bans strikes and protests. And now they've given the police the right to shoot at people who break into public buildings. So they've been preparing themselves. And one would see, I would personally say that it's been driving into this direction because the regime has been reluctant to fulfill the demands of the people. And the more it is reluctant, the more it needs to come with a heavy-handed policy, and the more despotic it becomes. It's slowly but surely divorcing itself from the aspirations of the people, and particularly with respect to Palestine, which is seeing this heavy clash, which has seen this heavy clash on Sunday, because people are sick and tired of rhetoric. You know,
Mohamed, I want to thank you so much for joining us and for giving us some more information on what's happening on the ground and what you experienced this weekend. We really appreciate you taking the time to share this with us.
Thank you.
You know, there's a lot that this brings up, and we're going to get deeper into some of the political elements of it and what it means for the nascent Egyptian state, the new formation of Egypt, as well as what's happening between Hamas and Fatah. But I understand we've got some stuff coming in from online.
Yeah, I just wanted to qualify that, you know, he was talking about how heavy-handed the government has been with regards to the protests outside the Israeli embassy, and our actual Cairo correspondent, one of them said, Rawia Rageh is really, it was very clear. She said, finally emerged from the scene of clashes outside the Israeli embassy in Cairo, one of the worst nights I ever experienced. And the next tweet, she said, there were a series of them, so feel free to go find them. But why do you do this, traitor, is what they said to her, calling her a traitor. Shouldn't you stay at home? As they smashed, you know, her phone memory cards, her USB, and her broken tape. So even though we saw the images of, you know, tear gas canisters being used against protesters, similar images to what happened in January 25th, it's quite startling to see how you know, our own journalist feels that this was the worst night, you know, as compared to the entire 18-day revolution.
This brings up another point that I would love to get your thoughts on, Ayman, because it seems like the revolution is still, it's almost like it's still in process. You know, we spoke with some Tunisian bloggers last week who were talking about the ongoing struggle in Tunisia against what they feel is a counter-revolution. There's a lot of instability here. Now, the Israeli government has been saying if you open the Rafah crossing, that there's going to be the opportunity for arms to come into Gaza. Given that Egypt is still in this transitionary phase, isn't there some credence to that possibility?
Well, it's certainly a valid concern on the Israeli part, but you have to be careful where, you know, as a journalist, one would argue, to what extent is that just to create a sense of phobia and fear? This is something that we heard a long time. We've been hearing it for a long time, and yet sometimes we don't necessarily see it materialize. I think the Egyptian government has a lot of challenges in the way it's building its institutions. It has to rebuild a lot of its security forces. But this all plays part into the fact that Egypt is reinventing itself. Because yes, for many years the Egyptian government was notorious for having strong security services, but it was also completely mismanaged. And despite having such a strong security force, and despite having the border completely closed, they were still able to get weapons and whatever they needed to get in to be able to carry on the armed resistance against Israel. So my point is, maybe now the Egyptian government doesn't necessarily need to have the most militarized or armed border, but can convince Palestinians instead, you don't need to necessarily smuggle weapons. We're going to open the border, and we're going to take a different approach in helping fight for your liberation.
So you're saying try to have a more effective border as opposed to a more militarized?
Absolutely. A more militarized border does not necessarily mean a more effective border. We see that in the United States. It can certainly be the same in a place like Gaza.
Well, we've got also an opportunity to hear from somebody who's reporting directly from within Palestine. Joining us via Skype from Bethlehem is John Elmer, a writer and photojournalist who lives in the West Bank. John, welcome to the stream.
Thanks for having me.
So, John, we're going to pull up some images while we speak of that you've taken on the ground, but you were in Kalandia and you saw some of the clashes that were happening there. Tell us a little bit of what you saw.
Well, I mean, most people that were there thought that they looked like images from the Second Intifada. I think the sort of stone throwing being met by strong security response from the Israelis is something that, well, doesn't need an intifada to go on here. It's a slow cook constantly in Palestine. The occupation breeds the resistance, and so anywhere that it's present, particularly in the form of the army, there's generally a fight back.
I'm curious, when people are talking about a call for a third intifada, third uprising, what is the actual outcome of that uprising that people are looking for? Is it the right of return for refugees? Is it the end of the Israeli state? What are people on the ground speaking of?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a known formula for the solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict for quite some time, and the things you mentioned are definitely part of the core attributes of that just solution to the conflict. I think we should be a little bit careful predicting a third intifada immediately. There's a number of things that are working against that right now in the Palestinian milieu, and I think that the other Arab uprisings have sort of lent some effort to try to say that it's going to spread to Palestine. But I think some things to be cautious about are, as you mentioned from Hamas earlier in the program, there's a lack of support at the top levels of Palestinian leadership for an intifada. From the Palestinian Authority, Abbas and Fayyad have more to lose by an uprising than they do to gain, and Hamas appears to be willing to be patient and sort of see through the changes that happen in Egypt, which could have more, as was mentioned, could have more impact on the Palestinian scene in some ways, arguably, than an indigenous uprising, because the role that Egypt played in blocking off the Palestinian economic, social, and political development, both locally and regionally, is a very important factor.
I want to get you in here, Glynnis, because you are with Business Insider, so you can hopefully give us a take on some of the economic factors that are at play, because you're looking at a lot of political upheaval, people making political statements. But what I'm taking from this is in part that there are some significant economic consequences to some of these potential actions. How do you think economic factors play into people's willingness to rise up and also the results of it?
Well, I think the question there might be, how do economic factors play into how the government is responding to these things? The Palestinian leadership has definitely got that in its mind, and when you see sort of the uprising from the ground, I'm not sure those people, the economic factors in the people on the ground are, we don't have jobs, we can't feed our families, we can't clothe ourselves.
But I think that's part of the question here, which is, if people don't feel like they can feed themselves, is that more of a concern that we want economic rights rather than political?
Well, I think it ties together, but if the people on the ground, their economic motivation is very basic and in the moment, and the government's economic motivation and how this ties into U.S. aid, I think, is probably the most important aspect of how much money they're getting from the U.S. Those are, I imagine, going across hairs to each other a little bit from time.
We're actually at the close of our time for the main show, so I want to thank all of you for joining us. I'm going to ask you everyone to hold tight, because we're going to continue this conversation during the post-show. If you've been tuning in, you know you can join us for the post-show at stream.aljazeera.com. We're going to be continuing this conversation, getting a little deeper into this. You can always reach us at facebook.com/AJStream and also tweet us at AJStream. We will see you online. Welcome back. This is the post show, and we're going to be getting a little more into the story we've been discussing right now, dealing with these Nakba commemorations of May 15th yesterday on the borders of Israel and Palestine. Now, we were just having this conversation, and Ahmed, I know that you pulled up some interesting stuff from online. Can you tell us a little bit about what you got?
Yeah, we have a lot of questions coming in about the implications of all this and trying to analyze, the geopolitics with Iran and their influence or their potential influence. But one video that we have that's quite powerful really highlights, this has been tweeted around a lot, and it really highlights the fact that we're seeing an unprecedented tactic where people are essentially coming in and trying to, confront the borders of these occupied territories. And the reason I mention this is because even though there's no million-man march, here you see how people crossed, Palestinian refugees and their supporters crossed into the Golan Heights from Syria. And I'm just going to play it and translate one small part of it. So they're literally crossing. You see, listen to this man. He's saying essentially, listen, guys, stop. And the reason they were cautioning them not to cross is because this is, allegedly there's tons of landmines there, and so they wanted to make sure that no one got injured. But the very reason that we're mentioning this is because people are tweeting in, for example, a question that was asked, and maybe John or Ayman or either of you could answer this. Could it be that the protest culture that's being created in Egypt is similar to that created by the South Africans after the apartheid, where you really see people mobilizing in ways they haven't before?
Well, this is sort of a tenuous connection to that, but I think what's missing sort of from this discussion right now is the huge role that Facebook is playing in Mideast politics.
Right.
And Facebook has become almost, it's too much to say it's its own government, but it's become such an enormously powerful player in Mideast politics, and yet it's not governed or elected by anybody. And I think there's some real thought should go into how much power social media has over these protests taking place, and how much control the people who are running Facebook have over how people in the Mideast are communicating with each other to mobilize.
Let me play devil's advocate here and just ask you a quick question, though. Do you think that the people that went down to the Golan Heights, to the fence yesterday, were motivated by Facebook, or and somehow saw something on Facebook that made them say, you know what, let's go down to the border between Syria and Golan and between Israel and the Golan?
Do you think? You would know better than I, but that's certainly the impression that I get. That's certainly the impression I get from reading about how the May 15th hashtag began, and the day was sort of formulated as the third Intifada, that it was through Facebook that then, you know, the Israeli government asked them to take down those pages, which then sprouted copycat pages and sprouted copycat pages. So I think they are an enormous player here in
it seems to me that these tools are being used in ways to advance interests that people have always had. So, you know, people were willing to rise up long before Facebook and Twitter existed, but now this is not only giving people organizing tools, but also it's giving the rest of the world a deeper window into what's happening. And one of the reasons I think that's worth noting
together,
is,
though, are doing it on the same day.
yeah, but it's also, you only have but so many people online.
That's right. The internet
having
penetration
access
in the Arab world is quite low.
Exactly.
I mean, it amplifies their voices, and it can, you know, coalesce more people and kind of bring more people into whatever fold they're trying to bring them into. But it's probably not,
well, so this is one thing
I think there's a difference between, you know, being an instigator and being a catalyst, and I think those are the slightly different roles. And I think, you know, when you look at one of the most powerful things is that footage of the people, you know, going down to the border. In some ways, traditionally, if we didn't have social media or the internet to see it, we probably would not have had to, because we would be held to the monopoly of mainstream media, which decides what to show. So yesterday, for example, if CNN or BBC or whatever, what have you, decides not to show that image, we would not be talking about it today. But in reality today, somebody else has the power to dictate on mainstream media. Watch this video, you should see it.
You know what's so interesting is this video came to me from Dima Khatib, who actually is an Al Jazeera employee. However, I've seen it, you know, before she tweeted it, other people had been tweeting it. And even during the revolution, you yourself, when you didn't have internet connection, had other people tweeting on your behalf. So the concept is, I think what you're saying is there's always a way to circumvent, you know, the older models or, you know, censorship.
Well, there's something else that I'm thinking, though, as I'm looking at this. I mean, so we're talking about the population, and we were speaking about this earlier before the show, that you have approximately an equal population of Palestinians in Palestine and outside in the Palestinian diaspora. So that means that you've got hundreds of thousands of Palestinians probably in a country like Syria. Why, when I'm looking at that border, and this may just be one moment in time. We don't know what happened over the course of the day. We don't have but so much context. But the first thing I'm seeing is there are not tens of thousands of people there. We're not seeing the kind of numbers as what I saw even in videos of the protests in Cairo outside the Israeli embassy. So part of what I'm wondering, and John, I want to get some of your thoughts into this, is how are people in Palestine, how are people in the West Bank where you are, talking about these ideas? Because if, as you've mentioned, they seem to have some more core economic concerns, is there a lack of willingness to pursue this new intifada, or is it that they want a certain kind of political solution that we haven't discussed yet?
Well, I think in Palestine you have to take into consideration a certain natural malaise that has taken place since the end of the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada was a very, very costly popular uprising for the Palestinians. It was combated by the Israelis with a tactic of destroying essential life in Palestine and targeting social, political, and economic and military installations with the same kind of vigor, and people lost their jobs, people lost family members, and then following on the heels of that, you have the Fatah-Hamas split, essentially a voided election, so Palestinians trying to take part in a democratic system were denied that by the West. and Israel. So you have a certain amount of political malaise that I think does make sense and I think needs to be understood before we start saying that there's going to be a third intifada, which there will be. There will be a third intifada, inevitably. The question is when it comes and how it comes, I think, more than it is if it will come or not.
You know, John, I just want to jump in because we have a question about, you know, the Arab League, and with Egypt continuing to head the Arab League. Nawara82 is saying, what changes do you think will take place regarding Gaza? She's referencing whether a no-fly zone will realistically happen. But, you know, as someone who's lived in the Arab world, lived in Egypt, been to Jordan, so on and so forth, what we're seeing in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria, where people are mobilizing, sure, it's not millions of people, but that alone is unprecedented, and obviously social media tools, you know, are contributing to that, but it's also the fact that the fear factor has essentially been broken. And so to answer this question, you know, we see the geopolitics of the region changing. You know, Jordan potentially and Morocco joining the GCC. We see Egypt's continuing to head the Arab League. But what do you, so to answer this question, do you think that there's any real changes that could happen, you know, with all these changes?
The short answer is no, not yet, because the Arab League, first of all, is very impotent. It can want to have a no-fly zone over Gaza as much as it wants, just like it did over Libya, but the sad reality of it is there's no Arab country that could capably, from a capability point of view, impose that no-fly zone. So one, you have that. Secondly, the Arab League right now is the collective will of Arab regimes. It's not the collective will of the Arab people. And so unless that becomes more in line, you're going to always have regimes that are looking at, or governments that are looking out for their interests, not necessarily looking out for the interests of their people. The good news is that there are some countries that are going to begin to transform. Now, whether or not they carry out that revolution successfully is still, you know, to be seen. Tunisia, Egypt are taking very positive steps. The question is, will those governments reflect the will of the people? If so, then they can start having a huge impact on the Arab League to start then in itself reflect the will of the broader collective Arab world.
It seems to me that if you have really responsible and transparent democracies rising up in the Arab world, you're going to have an interesting dynamic vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because Israel ceases to be the only democratic country in the region. You actually have other vibrant democracies. But, you know, unfortunately, we don't have an Israeli on the panel today. But one of the things that I would bring up from their side is, as they're looking at all of this stuff that's happening, you know, is there a real question? Is there an existential threat to Israel if you actually have democratic regimes in the Arab world that are pursuing the interests of Arab people? Or does that lead to more likelihood of finding forward progress in the peace process?
Well, I mean, just very briefly, there's two arguments to that. And one is you can look at a country like Turkey, Islamic country run by a predominantly Islamic party, secular, but has a very strong relationship with Israel, even though it's been a little bit on the
lately.
Yeah, but historically, it has had a very good relationship with Israel. There's arms deals, they recognize one another, exchange of diplomatic, cultural relations. So that could be a model if, you know, that's how some Arab countries pursue. But at the same time, there have been many who've argued that democracy and peace in the Arab world are the two biggest threats to the state of Israel, because you know, Israel is a country that has existed on the whole notion of security throughout its entire time. And so as a result, it's always pursued policies to kind of project security and stability. In reality, if you take away the justification for them to use force, then you'll have to have the Israelis talking to the Arabs on equal footing.
And that's the most interesting thing to me. But we've seen it in lots of places where people haven't had the ability to win via overwhelming force, that the idea of a different strategy or peaceful techniques, even the Egyptian revolution, arguably.
That's what the revolution
did. People always ask, like, what will happen if the Muslim Brotherhood comes to power, right? So people often want to, because there's this fear factor that's been, like, kind of, you know, told over the past couple of years. So it's interesting. The reason I bring this up is because, you know, you can't dictate democracy. If the Muslim Brotherhood is meant to come to power because the majority of Egyptians support them, if their policies then, the Egyptian people don't support them, with regards to Palestine and Israel or not, maybe even just domestically, then you would presume that they would then overthrow them, especially after this fear factor being broken. And I mention it because you have Fatah and Hamas now meeting in Egypt today. You have the Palestinians trying, you have across the Arab world people trying to take matters into their own hands. The Palestinians announcing that they're essentially going to try to seek recognition and establishment of a state regardless of what happens in the interim.
So here's my question. What happens if democracy comes to certain countries in the Middle East and the elected government is at odds with U.S. foreign policy?
Well, like they are in many situations, they should pursue that which is in the interest of its own people juxtaposed with what the U.S. is offering.
Which is what we do
Which is
all
what we
around
do.
the
I mean,
world.
the United States wanted to fly over Turkey to bomb Iraq. The Turkish government felt that's not in the interest of the Turkish people, so they had an odd. And, you know, there was a disagreement. It didn't jeopardize Turkish-U.S. relations. Yes, there was some strong language, but at the end of the day, they're still very close members and members of NATO.
Unfortunately, this is the end of our show. John, I want to thank you for joining us on the West Bank. So much to talk about. Thanks to our audience for being a part of this. We will see you again on television tomorrow. Tweet us at AJStream to be a part of this conversation.